Yeah, site finding workshop. So just to give you a little overview, if we can have the next slide. Oh, I can do it, can't I? Can I? No. So we're going to talk about creating a site brief. Now, site briefs are really important for us to understand what everybody wants to do, but also to talk to other people about it. Land search tools, as I said, planning and legal, connecting with developers and councils, and then we're going to go into a bit of detail about what councils can and should be doing. And then we'll do a little bit of an overview of what WMUCH can actually do to support site finding activity. So creating a site brief. Some of you may know this, some of you may have known that a site brief exists but haven't done one, but they're super helpful for a number of reasons. One, because everybody in your group and in your organisation gets an opportunity to say what you're actually looking for. It's just like buying a house, that you wouldn't just randomly buy any house because it's somewhere that you want to live. You actually have generally a set of criteria for what you're looking for. So this actually does define the criteria of what you want in a site. It generally indicates what your group is, what your project purpose is, and it would identify the specifics of the scheme size. So how big are you looking? The type of development, so really broadly, whether it's housing or whether it's mixed use, your preferred geography, including what access you need to utilities, social infrastructure, facilities and transport. So for instance, if you're looking to do a build for older people, you might want to think about not doing it on a hill. In these sorts of concerns, you might want, if you've got people that need to get to work or childcare or healthcare facilities, you want some decent infrastructure, bearing in mind that creating infrastructure costs a lot, and access to utilities is also really important. So if you're looking at something in the middle of nowhere, it's generally going to cost quite a lot of money to bring the utilities to a site without any. So all of those things are really important to consider. The type of site, also very important in terms of the land type. So we'll be talking later a little bit about brownfield sites, but the type of site is going to really be important to you. If you are looking for a large site, for instance, then infill's not necessarily your best option. And if you're looking for access to green spaces, you might not want to be thinking about an urban space particularly. It's really important that you know exactly what you are wanting, and most importantly that you understand what the costs associated with that thing are going to be. So like I said, you know, having utilities put in especially is going to be extremely expensive. Dealing with ground conditions can be very expensive. So if it's a brownfield site with contamination, it might look good on paper, but it might cost a fortune to actually do the remediation work. So all of these things need considering, and ideally you have a priority list of the things that are definite no's or absolute requirements. So you might say that you know, if you've got, say, so like an older person's accommodation, for instance, you absolutely wouldn't have somewhere where it's the transport and infrastructure is not great. So all of those things can go on a site brief. That site brief can then be used for funding, for speaking to funders, for speaking to councils, for speaking to land agents, and it's a great way of actually identifying what your group definitely wants and pin those details down so that you all agree on what you're looking for. Okay, so in terms of tools for finding sites, appreciate that sometimes groups form because a site has been found. What we're talking about really here is more a case where you've got an intent and a group that want to do something but no site. So a really early way of identifying potential sites is using Google Maps. Most places are looking at a locality that known to them. Some people are looking broader than that, obviously. But one of the best ways to actually identify places that have potential is just to walk around, and just spot places that look possible, or to do a 2D or 3D Google search. This particular image is of somewhere fairly close to where I live that I spotted by just poking about in Google looking for what looked like derelict buildings, because I was doing a self-help project. And you can spot derelict after a while quite easily from above, because the roofs tend to be a little bit dodgy. There can be sites like rubbly sites, and it's worth exploring those using Google in the first instance. You can do quite a broad search quite quickly in that way. Next slide, please. So drilling down, there are a few search tools available that allow you to find out who actually owns properties. A lot of them are based on knowing what an address is, or a postcode, whereas some tools are much broader and can tell you a lot more information. This is a tool that I've used for quite a few years, which is just brilliant and not well known, which is a bit odd. It's a free to use tool, and it's called Nimbus. You can actually map a large area, and it will tell you all the home ownership, whether it's freehold, leasehold, owned by the council, whether it's retail. So the land use as well is all shown on little flags. And if you click on the flag, it'll tell you who that piece of land belongs to, or who the building belongs to. And it'll also give you access to purchase the titles or a report. And just to point out that once you've found somewhere and you know who owns it, you can buy the land deeds, you can buy the information about the title or the deeds much cheaper through the land registry than you can through Nimbus, which is a bit bad because that's their model. But yeah, it's £7 rather than £3. But you can find land rather than buildings, which you can't do on the land registry. So if you see on this particular image, there's a little flag by the side of this. It's a pub, and that land is actually owned by a different person than the pub itself. And then if you see there's land like a grass verge, there's also a flag on that, and that tells you that's owned by the council. So this is a brilliant tool for site consolidation and understanding where there's multiple ownership. There's also a electrical substation to the side of it, which means you would need to deal with 4 different owners on this particular site in order to actually get hold of it. So it's really, really useful for understanding how complicated it can be in terms of site ownership and talking to the right people. Okay, next slide. So the land registry is a great site when you know the postcodes or the property location in order to find out who owns it. And like I said, it costs £3 to get the title plan or the register. It'll also tell you, there's also reports on flood indicators, which is a very useful thing to be able to know. So in terms of just kind of scanning the areas, rather than going to anyone else's, just doing a personal desktop search, those 3 tools are very, very useful and can give you an awful lot of information. Okay. Another very useful thing to do in terms of understanding what the situation is with any given property or often piece of land is to use the planning application search tools and find out who's been trying to do things, what they've been trying to do. You have to be sometimes quite creative with the term you use, because pieces of land like verges and strips that are good for like 5 or 10 houses are often described by the intersection between 2 roads of where it lies, or the west side of such and such a road. So you might have to be a bit creative and use road names and local markers, and you don't know what the planning officer has called it. So creative searching, just like you would on Google to try and find things, is very handy. but you can find every planning application and everything that's been related to that particular building or piece of land in the list. Often older crumbling heritage buildings have an awful lot of planning application attached to them, but it's always handy to find out what's actually happened and where the planning applications have been declined in particular, for various reasons. So it's always great just to have a poke about before you even talk to anyone about a property. Okay. In terms of legal considerations, this is really focused on housing rather than land, this particular slide. But you can change the use of land relatively easily in some circumstances, and it's much more difficult in others. But don't not consider something just because it's got a different use code. So you can change commercial to residential relatively easily, because there's a permitted development rights piece of legislation attached to it to make it easier to do so. And also greenbelt land isn't completely off the table if you're looking at an infill and it works for the planning authority. So, you know, you don't have to just say, oh, it's agricultural land, we can't do anything with it. There are ways to change use, but sometimes it's quite expensive to do. There are other conditions you need to think about on land and existing buildings. Some buildings carry charges and liabilities, like if you're in a parish council, you might have to pay for church repairs, chancel repairs. There's other parish rules, and it tends to be parishes that really get you on charges and liabilities. Covenants can be in place. I was working with a group who found an orchard that we were going to convert into a community centre housing and maintain and bring the orchard back, but there was a 50-year covenant which said you couldn't do any development on it until that time. So, you know, it can kind of scupper, based on the fact that most of us would be dead by then. We didn't go for that. It's can be a bit of a challenge sometimes. Easement and way leaves, again, there's rights of ways, there's ransom strips where an owner can hold on to a piece of property or a part of a piece of property. They can actually make you buy that off them for an extortionate amount of money, which sadly happens. And then there's access to utilities and other easements and rights of way, basically, that you need to know about, because if you build over it, obviously the person can't get to it. There's obviously restrictions and deeds of covenant, which you know we can use to our own benefit to make sure houses are kept in perpetuity at a certain rate. There's all sorts of rules that are obtuse that have been there forever that you wouldn't necessarily know or understand, but you need to be aware that very often there are deeds and covenants and restrictions on land that are going to change the value or change the way that you might work. And then there's mines, the old coal board rules. Sometimes you can't build on land that's had a mine on, which is understandable because you don't want things to collapse, but you need to be aware of those sorts of things. So that's after you've found a site and before you've really looked into it very much. Be aware there are often legal considerations and restrictions associated with that land. Okay, and so a lot of the time we find that working through the council can be a challenge. Sometimes it takes a long time and a lot of negotiation. Occasionally it's a lot quicker and easier to go through a conversation with a private owner or a private developer. So private owners, particularly in the context of self-help housing and regeneration, quite often you can talk to them and find out why they haven't done anything with a house or a set of houses, and they may well be happy to join your organisation or support your organisation. It's very, very handy to do if you've got a complex site consolidation situation. If somebody's got a house, there's a big piece of land with one house in it, you need to talk to that person. I mean, it's community engagement 101, but sometimes that person will work with you in order to build around them. Without talking to them, you're not going anywhere, basically. Private landowners, quite often land purchases are much easier through a private landowner than they are trying to get things out of the council, but then you don't get the reduction rates and all the benefits of working through a council. But you can create social infrastructure more easily if you've got a private landowner on your side. It's often much quicker just to get hold of that piece of land through them. Can be more expensive on the open market, but quite often councils only sell on the open market anyway. So definitely worth doing, definitely worth poking about and talking to people. And then private developers have more opportunities than we think. I think there are a lot of developers that have land where there's a pocket of land that's just very difficult to develop, or not viable, or just it cuts into their margins too much to consider it, and they're quite often happy to talk about options with other groups, other developers, community groups. It's not unheard of, and particularly in places where it's very hard for them when they want a really high margin. It's much easier for them to do that because it builds up their case with the council to have some social value associated with their application for sites and planning permission. So it's in their best interest to work with community groups in order to make difficult sites viable. And then we've got section 106 obligations, which part of the wider, bigger developments that we'll talk about in a little while, that are also an option. Okay, I think that's my last slide.
Yeah, do you want to pause and check for any questions?
Yeah, so looking at questions now, we've got a couple of questions in the chat. Will slides be distributed? Yes, we'll put them online. We'll put them on the website. And yes, Nimbus maps. So just search Nimbus on Google and it should find it. And you just sign up and it gives you a free account. And I haven't found anything I wanted that I couldn't access through the free account. It's really worth having a look at.
If you were to engage with a developer that owns some land, would they, obviously it depends on the developer and the conversation, but I was just wondering whether they would sell that land to you or whether they'd create a deal to build it with you. Or,
they can do either. You can set up you can create the agreement between yourselves, but they will sell land, but I think they're more likely to want to create an arrangement where a community group works in partnership with them.
Yeah.
But obviously it's it's negotiation. You can put whatever you like on the table as long as it sounds like a good deal for them. Okay, over to you, Abby.
Okay, just resume the share. Okay, can you see that slide again now? Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to say a little bit about working with councils and local authorities to identify land. And around the country, councils have played an important role in unlocking access to land for successful community-led housing projects. Clearly, the West Midlands is a densely populated urban area, so I wouldn't say there are kind of easy answers or quick fixes in terms of land supply for councils, but generally we're finding that they're supportive of community-led housing in principle and keen to consider what they can do on a case-by-case basis to enable these kinds of schemes. So just a few different kind of parts of councils to think about when you're planning engagement, and we've been starting to kind of build these relationships ourselves. We see that as an important role for us as a hub, to build relationships with the local authorities so we can influence them to think about community-led housing and introduce groups as where appropriate. So the first kind of category here is officers, so employees of the council, who are most likely to have a strategic interest in community-led housing. So we generally start with the housing strategy team and also the community engagement development partnership they have different names in different places, team, are likely to kind of care about this too. And we're finding that if you can get kind of a strategic commitment from these teams, then they can help to influence some other departments that clearly could have an important role as well. So that's the kind of second category on this slide here. The planning team are the ones who are giving planning permission. Asset management are the ones that are managing the council's portfolio of land and assets and potentially selling those. And then some councils have their own development and regeneration departments who are building homes themselves. Others will outsource that to arm's length management organisations or other partners like registered providers. Worth remembering local politicians too, so local councillors might really be keen to get behind these kinds of schemes and help to kind of influence the council at an officer level. And there's usually a cabinet member with a specific remit for housing and or communities as well. So it can be useful to get them on board. And then finally, there's a number of resources that the council might publish that'll help you to get an idea of their priorities and kind of what the scope is for development in your area, strategies, local plans, and some of them have conducted more sort of strategic land audits to try and identify land that's good for housing development. So you can look out for those. There are quite a few different things that local authorities can do in theory to enable community-led housing, and there are some nice examples from all around the country. So sometimes kind of small complex sites can be a good fit for community-led housing, then maybe not so viable or attractive to other kinds of developers, and local authorities can help to make them available. So a bunker housing cooperative in Brighton, for example, are developing on a range of local authority infill and garage sites. There are examples from around the country where local authorities have transferred empty properties to community groups or offered them on a long lease. So this photo is from Canopy in Leeds, which provides self-help housing for people who are homeless. The council's transferred and offered to them on a long lease empty properties. There are also examples where some local authorities have been really kind of progressive and using social value tools to kind of quantify like the social impact and community benefit of a scheme to make the case to kind of either designate certain sites for community-led housing or to set up sort of exclusivity periods that give a community group the time to kind of make a plan and raise the finance to purchase a site. Bristol are one kind of local authority that have been leading the way on this. So these things are all possible. As I say, I think in the West Midlands at the moment, it's about kind of approaching these ideas on a case-by-case basis to start. Of course, the council is also the planning authority, so they've got planning policy tools at their disposal that can help to make this happen. The local and neighbourhood plans will set out plans for what could be developed in the local area. Section 106 is a tool that H mentioned and has been kind of useful for community groups around the country. So this is an agreement between a developer applying for planning permission and the planning authority to kind of offset the impact of their development on the local community. Often that will come in the form of a percentage of affordable homes to be built on a site. So the photo here from Bradwell CLT in the Peak District, they managed to acquire 12 new build homes from a private developer, actually in this case at no cost as the Section 106 contribution from the developer, because those requirements were written into the neighbourhood plan. And we've seen a bit of interest in kind of the Section 106 idea from local authorities that we've been talking to in the region. There are other kind of obligations of councils and certain registers that they must keep. So the Self and Custom Build Register, and make land available for that. Currently, the government is out to consultation on the right to regenerate, which could give kind of communities enhanced powers to develop on kind of underutilised public land. And they must keep a brownfield site register and a register of assets of community value, which I'll talk about a little bit more on the next slide. So the brownfield land register, councils are legally required to keep that. They must update it at least once a year, and that identifies the sites that they've kind of considered to be appropriate for residential development. And I mentioned they also need to keep a register of assets of community value, and that's for the purpose of the right to bid. So where a council decides that they'd like to sell an asset of community value, they need to make notification of that so that community interest groups are aware of that opportunity and have the chance to bid to buy the asset. Now, as I've kind of hinted at already, we started to have conversations with local authorities about their own land and any kind of opportunities to enable community-led housing. As I mentioned, the general message is that land supply is quite tight. Like, lots of the councils don't have many land assets. Often the land that they do have for residential development is prioritised for social housing. So the council or an ALMO or a housing association might be building those homes. So if you are interested in building social homes, then there could be kind of alignment and partnership potential there. In terms of what kind of land the local authorities own, lots of contaminated and brownfield land in many areas. With Solihull is maybe the main exception to that, with actually a lot of green belt land. Often the sites are smaller, kind of a bit more complex, garage sites, old school sites, things like that. As well as land itself, there are empty homes kind of pepper potted around most of the local authorities where we work. But it is possible that the council can identify land or assets as surplus and decide to dispose of them. As H mentioned, usually they'll be sold on the market at best consideration, given the sort of financial constraints that the councils are under at the moment. So not much discounted land around, but there's definitely the potential to make the case for social value and community benefit, particularly in terms of giving kind of community groups a bit of a sort of priority and an opportunity to work up plans and raise the finance to purchase land and assets. I mentioned that some are interested in that Section 106 idea, where they've got developers who are building kind of a proportion of affordable homes on their development. Often a housing association might take on those units, but I think that we could make the case for a community organisation to do that as well, if that was of interest. And then just worth mentioning that the combined authority also own land. They don't kind of develop it directly themselves, but they look for delivery partners to bring forward that land and build homes on it, really. It's generally brownfield, and it can include quite the larger sites and new settlements, as opposed to those kind of little local authority sites we've been talking about. So there are potential opportunities for a smaller part of those larger developments to be community-led, perhaps in partnership with others. And then finally, just to mention that other public landowners are available, really, and that there are kind of others who who might have a specific interest in social impact and community benefit as well, and might have land and buildings that they want to sell. So we know, for example, one group that's having some promising early conversations with the Police and Crime Commissioner, who have old police station sites that are kind of surplus to requirements now, and they're looking to dispose of. I mentioned a couple of times there the potential to work with other kinds of partners who are developing homes in your area. It's definitely worth bearing that in mind. Who is building and might be interesting to work with you, because they can play a really key role in helping to find sites and building the homes. So that they might be council or housing associations or private developers. Clearly they'll have different priorities around tenure and things. You know, some of them will be interested in social, affordable, shared ownership, private sale kind of homes. So it depends on, I suppose, what sort of homes that you're looking to build as to what kind of partner could be right for you. We have an event coming up on the 1st of March about partnership working with these kinds of development partners. So if you haven't already, have a look on our website and you can sign up for that. The example pictured here is from Leeds, where a private developer is working on the Climate Innovation District as part of a regeneration programme, and they're working in partnership with Leeds Community Homes and have a plan to establish a community interest company that can take on the ownership of 16 affordable flats that are pepper potted across that wider, larger development. And I wanted to share a few kind of recent success stories of projects finding sites in the West Midlands. I know I've kind of said that there's not lots of public land around, but that we've got some examples of success. It can be done here. So 2020 Housing Cooperative, they identified a small local authority owned site that didn't really have much scope for other commercial development, and they're currently working on plans for 11 flats with a garden and that will house tenants from the council's housing register and maybe St Basil's homeless charity as well. The second one here is Sturchley Cooperative Development. They have just been successful within the last couple of weeks, actually, of getting planning permission for their scheme. This one's different in that the land, this was actually a private land owned by Seven Capital. And this was an example where, as H mentioned earlier, this kind of portion of the site wasn't particularly kind of viable or attractive to them for commercial development. So they are now able to use it to build just under 40 affordable rented apartments, along with 4 commercial units for established worker cooperatives based in Sturchley. So an example of success on private land, and then a couple of others on public land. So Selly Oak Community Development Trust, they identified a kind of small plot of a neglected sort of local authority recreational site with a skate park and sports courts and things. And they are looking at kind of building 10 to 20 family homes on the sites in a neighbourhood that's quite dominated by student housing. So part of the purpose of that project was to provide good family homes in the area, as well to support the kind of local services and economy and create a thriving neighbourhood there. The final one is Stourbridge Community Development Trust. Again, this is another small local authority owned site. Dudley Council transferred it to them actually after a campaign to secure a different larger site, but they were successful in getting this one in the end from the council, and they're looking to build 12 apartments with kind of a makerspace and workspace for creatives in Dudley. And finally, just a note on what we as West Midlands Urban Community Homes can do to help you identify sites. So if you've worked up a site brief, then we can share that in our networks really. So we can share with the local authority, probably firstly our contacts in kind of housing strategy, and see if they can help to kind of identify that anything that might be a good fit. Likewise, we're trying to identify kind of partners like housing associations who are up for this kind of partnership working, who we can introduce community groups to and their briefs as well. If you have sort of identified a site and are trying to find out a bit more about it, we might be able to help check whether it's council owned if that's a bit unclear. We can help to make that case for social value. There are kind of tools around in the sector that have been used to do that quite successfully. And our advisors can also provide some advice on how to go about investigating the site and check whether it's the right one and viable for you. So that's at kind of a project by project basis. If a number of groups share their site briefs with us, then that helps us to give a more kind of collective view for demand for land from community-led housing projects in the region, and we can share that with kind of policymakers and landowners and try to make a bit more of a strategic case. I suppose that would be the goal, and kind of help to suggest that we, you know, there's demand out there, and they could be earmarking maybe some sites for community-led housing, or helping to kind of provide data on what might be available. And finally, just to say that we are kind of working strategically to try and make the case to include community-led housing schemes as part of larger developments. So those conversations with local authorities about Section 106 opportunities, with housing associations who might be building out larger developments and interested to think about how they could build an element of community stewardship into their scheme, with the combined authority about bringing forward those big brownfield sites and whether community-led housing could have a role to play there, and kind of taking part in conversations. Like they have a task force around public land, so we're engaging in all those kinds of conversations and trying to make sure that community-led housing is on the agenda there, and to look out for opportunities. I'm going to stop there. You've got our email address on screen here if you'd like to get in touch. As I mentioned, we do have advisors and can offer some kind of free support and advice initially to help you on your way. So we'd love to hear from you if you're serious about making a project happen.